I didn't realize something was wrong right away, and that is probably the part that annoyed me the most later, because all the signs were there from the beginning, just not in a way that made sense until I already had enough pieces to put together a much uglier picture. At first it was just small things, the kind of details that feel too minor to question unless you are already looking for a problem. A chair would be slightly out of place when I came home from work, or there would be a smell in the apartment that didn't match anything I had cooked in the last couple of days, and I kept explaining it away in the most convenient ways possible, because that is what people usually do when they want life to stay simple. If I was tired, I blamed being tired. If I had a long day, I told myself maybe I was just noticing things differently. If something looked slightly moved, I assumed I had done it absent-mindedly and forgotten. None of it felt serious enough on its own to stop me and say, something is happening in my apartment when I'm not here. I live alone, or at least I thought I did, and my life is not chaotic in any interesting way. I work regular hours, sometimes later than I want. I come home, I make food, I sit at my desk for a while, and then I go to sleep. On weekends, I mostly keep to myself unless I already have plans. My place reflects that. It isn't some ultra-clean showroom, but it is consistent, and when you live that way long enough, you know your own space without having to think about it. You know where things sit when you leave them somewhere. You know what the apartment smells like when you open the door, and you know what kind of silence belongs to your own place. That kind of familiarity is easy to take for granted until it starts getting interrupted by things that don't belong there. The only other person who had a key was my sister, and even that was never supposed to become some open-ended arrangement. I gave her the spare a few months earlier when she said things with her roommate were getting messy, and she might need a place to cool off sometimes if there was drama at the apartment. It sounded temporary, vague, and harmless in the way family favors often sound right before they stop being one. At the time, I didn't overthink it. She was my sister. She wasn't asking to move in. She just wanted the security of knowing she had somewhere to go if things blew up for a night. I told her fine, keep the spare, just let me know if you ever actually need to use it. She agreed, and because that matched exactly what I wanted to hear, I didn't push it any further. Looking back, that was the first mistake, not because giving her the key was automatically stupid, but because I treated "let me know" like an actual boundary when really it was more of a casual expectation, and casual expectations are exactly what people step over when they convince themselves they have a good enough reason. The first moment that made me stop and really question things happened on a Tuesday evening. I got home later than usual, probably around 8, and as soon as I opened the front door, I noticed the kitchen light was on. I am annoyingly consistent about things like that, mostly because I hate coming home and feeling like I left something unfinished, so I always turn lights off before I leave unless there is some very obvious reason not to. Seeing that light on immediately bothered me, but not in a dramatic way. It was more that particular kind of irritation you get when something small is wrong in a place that usually behaves exactly as expected. I stood there for a couple of seconds before I even stepped inside, just looking down the hall toward the kitchen like the light itself might somehow explain what was going on if I gave it enough time. Then I went in, set my bag down, and walked into the kitchen, where the sink had dishes in it that I knew for a fact were not there when I left that morning. Not just a cup or a plate, either. There were several things, enough to show that someone had made food, and then walked away from the cleanup with the confidence of a person who assumed they could always deal with it later. That was the first time the thought formed clearly enough to bother me, because until then, everything could still be explained as me forgetting something or not paying attention. Dishes don't explain themselves. Dishes mean someone was there long enough to use the space like they were comfortable in it. I checked the living room next, and half of me expected to see my sister there, maybe on the couch with her laptop, acting like this was all ordinary, but the room was empty. The TV was off, the coffee table looked mostly normal, and for one second I thought maybe the whole thing would still collapse back into a smaller explanation. Then I saw a bag near the chair by the window, and I knew immediately it wasn't mine. It wasn't one I recognized as hers either, or at least not any bag I had seen her carry before. It looked like something that belonged to a third person, and that changed the whole feeling of the apartment in an instant. I remember just standing there and staring at it, because your brain does this stupid thing when you are confronted with a detail that doesn't fit. Instead of going straight to the conclusion, it tries out a bunch of weaker ones first, like maybe she had a friend over for a bit, maybe she borrowed the bag, maybe I just wasn't recognizing it properly because I was tired. The problem was that once the question became, why was anyone else here at all? Every softer explanation still led back to the same issue, which was that someone had been in my apartment while I was gone and no one had told me. So I called her. She didn't pick up the first time, which made the whole thing worse immediately because now I wasn't just standing in my apartment noticing signs of someone else's presence. I was doing it while waiting for a person who should have answered quickly if there was an easy explanation. By the time she called back a few minutes later, I had already walked back through the kitchen, checked the bathroom, and stood in my bedroom doorway long enough to confirm that while nothing looked obviously disturbed, the place no longer felt fully untouched either. When she answered, she sounded normal in a way that was almost insulting. Not cheerful, not tense, just normal, like I had called during an ordinary part of her evening and interrupted nothing more serious than scrolling or making tea. I asked if she had been at my place that day, and I kept my voice neutral on purpose because at that point I still wanted to leave room for this to be something small. She said yes, casually, and then added that she'd stopped by because she needed a quiet place to work for a few hours. That explanation didn't land right, mostly because it came too quickly, like she had one ready, and because it didn't explain the bag I was looking at. So I asked about that, and there was just enough of a pause on the line to make me pay attention. Then she said it probably belonged to a friend who came with her. That probably irritated me on the spot. If someone brings a friend into your apartment, they know whether the friend brought a bag. There is no probably in that kind of answer unless the speaker is trying to keep the whole thing loose and casual so you don't focus on it too hard. I asked if the friend was still there, and she said no, they had both left hours ago. Then she added, too quickly again, that she would grab the bag later and that I didn't need to worry about it. What made that sentence so annoying was not just the assumption that I would stop at "don't worry about it," but the fact that she immediately tried to move the conversation on from the only part that actually mattered. She started asking about my day and my trip back, and it felt so deliberate that I almost laughed, because there I was standing in my own apartment, looking at evidence that she had brought someone there without telling me, and she wanted to talk like we were in the middle of some normal sibling check-in. I didn't push hard enough then, and I know that now. I told her I wanted a heads up if she was going to use my place, especially if other people were involved, and she said yes, of course, sorry, things got rushed, and she'd get the bag later. The whole thing ended with just enough apology to make me feel like maybe I was about to turn something minor into a bigger issue than it needed to be. That was my second mistake. Because once people see that a boundary can be crossed and then patched over with a quick explanation, they don't usually treat that as the end of the incident. They treat it as proof that the structure still holds. The next couple of days felt normal enough on the surface, but that small unease didn't really leave. I kept noticing details that might have meant nothing or might have meant everything, depending on how suspicious you were willing to let yourself become. There would be a glass in the sink when I was almost sure I hadn't used one. A hand towel would be folded differently than how I leave it. The thermostat was once on a setting I never use. None of those things were enough on their own to start a fight over, but together they kept producing the same uncomfortable thought in the back of my head, which was that my apartment didn't feel entirely private anymore. By the weekend, I had nearly convinced myself I was overthinking it, and that is probably why the next thing hit so hard, because I had already done the mental work of trying to be reasonable. I got home in the middle of the afternoon on Saturday because one of my plans got canceled earlier than expected, and as soon as I opened the door, I knew someone was there. There was no mystery about it this time. I could hear movement from the hallway, and there were voices, low and relaxed, coming from the direction of the bedroom. I closed the door behind me harder than I meant to, and the voices stopped immediately. That kind of silence is different from normal silence. It has shape. It tells you that the people making the noise know someone just walked in and are now trying to understand whether they're supposed to be worried. I walked down the hallway and stopped outside my bedroom door. It was partially closed, which already made no sense because I never leave it like that when I'm home. And then it opened just enough for my sister to look out with an expression that landed somewhere between irritated and surprised. Not guilty. That's important. Not guilty. She looked like I had inconvenienced her by arriving without warning, which is still one of the things that makes me angry when I think about it, because it told me more clearly than anything she actually said that she had started seeing my apartment less as my space and more as some shared extension of her options. I asked what she was doing, and she stepped out into the hall in a way that tried to make the situation feel smaller than it was. She said she was just using the place for a few hours because her own place was impossible to work in and she needed quiet. Then, before I could even answer that, a guy I had never seen before came into view behind her. He wasn't doing anything dramatic or creepy. He just looked like someone who had been sitting on my bed having an ordinary conversation in a room he assumed he was allowed to be in. That made it worse, not better. I asked who he was, and she said he was a friend helping her with some project. Again, completely normal tone. Completely normal phrasing. As if the only unusual thing in the room was my reaction. That was the first moment I felt the situation move from annoying into something I knew I wasn't going to let slide, because this wasn't her crashing for an hour anymore, and it wasn't even her using the place badly. It was her extending access. She was using my apartment as a location she controlled well enough to bring other people into it, and once that happens, the whole structure changes. I told her we needed to talk right then, and she rolled her eyes slightly before telling her friend she'd be back in a minute. That eye roll was small, but it mattered, because it showed me that in her mind the unreasonable thing here wasn't what she was doing. It was that I was interrupting it. We stepped into the kitchen, and I asked her directly why she thought it was acceptable to bring random people into my apartment when I wasn't there, and without telling me. She immediately started minimizing. She said it wasn't random because she knew him, that he was only there for a little while, that they weren't doing anything, and that I needed to calm down because I was acting like she had rented the place out to strangers. The problem with that line was that it pushed the whole thing too far in the exact direction she was trying to mock, because once she said it, my brain locked onto the idea that the actual line she believed she hadn't crossed was not using your brother's apartment without permission, but doing something even worse than that. And that was the first time Airbnb crossed my mind. Not because she had said it, because of how defensive she was about a smaller version of the same principle. I asked her if anyone else had been using my apartment besides her and that guy, and she said no too quickly. Then she corrected herself and said maybe 1 or 2 people had stopped by with her a couple of times, but nothing serious. And at that point the conversation stopped being about getting answers and started being about watching her revise her own version of events in real time. That was when I knew this thing was already bigger than what I had physically caught her doing. I didn't know exactly how much bigger yet, but I knew I was no longer dealing with a one-off misuse of a spare key. I was dealing with someone who had gotten comfortable enough inside my space to build her own version of normal there. And once people get comfortable enough to do that, there is almost always more going on than the first layer they admit to. Once I realized I was no longer dealing with a one-off misuse of a spare key, the whole conversation changed shape in my head, because up until then I had still been trying to figure out how annoyed I was supposed to be. Whether this was one of those situations that looks worse than it is when you first walk into it, or whether it was actually as disrespectful as it felt. The second she started revising her story in front of me, going from "it was just me" to "okay, maybe 1 or 2 people stopped by," I stopped worrying about whether I was overreacting. People do not revise downward when they are telling the whole truth. They revise because they are testing how much of the truth can be tolerated. I asked her directly how many times she had been using my apartment while I was gone or at work, and instead of answering that like a normal person, she got irritated that I was framing it that way at all. She said I was making it sound shady when all she had done was use the place a few times because it was quiet, and because her own apartment was chaotic, and because I wasn't even using it during the hours she came over. The way she said that last part made the whole thing even worse, because it revealed the logic she had quietly built for herself. In her head, my apartment was mine in theory, but available in practice whenever I was not physically inside it. That is a very specific kind of entitlement, and once you hear it clearly, you cannot really pretend it came from a simple misunderstanding. I told her that I do not need to be standing in my own kitchen for my apartment to count as occupied by me, and she gave me that tight, dismissive little smile people use when they still think they can talk you out of your own reaction if they keep making your position sound a little too rigid. Then she asked me if I was seriously going to act like this over her using the place a few times when nothing had been damaged and nothing bad had happened. And that was one of those sentences that sounds stupidly reasonable if you strip it away from the actual context. Of course nothing had been damaged. Of course nothing bad had happened in the obvious sense. The problem was that she had already decided the standard for what counted as serious by reducing it all to whether I came home to a broken TV and a trashed couch. What made it worse was that the guy she brought with her was still in my bedroom, which meant we were not having this argument in some abstract vacuum where I could take time to cool off and think about it later. We were having it while another person, someone I did not know and had never invited, was physically present inside my most private room. That detail alone kept dragging the whole thing back to reality every time she tried to shrink it with language. I asked her if this friend had been there before, and she said no, which might have meant nothing if I still trusted the rest of what she was saying, but by then I didn't. There was already too much hedging, too much minimizing, too much, it's not a big deal energy for me to take any neat answer at face value. So instead of debating that point, I asked her something more useful. I asked whether she had ever been in the apartment without telling me and brought other people here while I was not around. She did not say yes, but she also didn't say no in a clean enough way to make me believe her. She said something like, "Not like that," which is one of those slippery phrases people reach for when the full answer is going to make them look worse. I told her to get him out of my apartment right then, and she looked at me like I was making a performance out of something that should have stayed private. That expression really got under my skin, because it carried the exact same assumption I had been noticing from the start, which was that my reaction was the disruptive thing, not the fact that she had built this whole unofficial arrangement around access to my home without my permission. But she did go get him, and that mattered. She did not keep arguing in the moment, which told me that underneath all the annoyance, she knew there was a line there after all. He came out a minute later looking uncomfortable in the very understandable way anyone would look if they realized they had accidentally stepped into a family situation they should never have been part of. He mumbled something polite, grabbed his things, and left without trying to explain himself. I almost felt bad for him, because unlike my sister, he genuinely looked like someone who had been told a much simpler version of the truth and had just discovered he was standing in the middle of someone else's boundary problem. After the door closed behind him, the apartment felt smaller in a way it hadn't a few minutes earlier. It wasn't because he had done anything dramatic. It was because once a stranger walks through your space under somebody else's permission, every object in the room suddenly feels like evidence. The chair is not just a chair anymore. It is where someone sat who should not have been there. The bedroom is not just your bedroom. It is a place someone entered because another person decided your privacy was negotiable. That is the kind of thing people who overstep never seem to understand. They think if there is no damage, the violation stays abstract. It doesn't. It settles into the room. I asked her one more time, calmly, to tell me exactly how many times she had used the apartment while I was not there. She sighed in that dramatic way people do when they want the problem to become your persistence instead of their behavior, and then she said she had come by a handful of times. I asked what a handful meant, and after another useless little pause, she said maybe 5 or 6. The number itself did not shock me so much as the casual way she offered it once she accepted she could no longer protect it. 5 or 6 times. That is not panic use. That is not emergency use. That is a pattern. Then I asked the question that had already been sitting in the back of my mind since the weird way she reacted in the kitchen. I asked if she had ever let anyone use my apartment when she was not here with them. She looked at me for about half a second too long before answering, and that half second was enough to tell me the answer mattered before she even gave it. She said no, but she said it with the tone people use when they are trying to step over the deeper issue by answering the exact wording instead of the real meaning. That is hard to explain if you haven't heard it before, but once you hear it from someone close to you enough times, you recognize it instantly. It is the sound of someone keeping the lie technically narrow. I told her to hand me the spare key. She blinked once, like she wasn't expecting me to move there yet, and then asked why I was escalating it so quickly. That question honestly almost made me laugh, because there is something infuriating about being asked why you are escalating after discovering that your own apartment has been turned into somebody else's flexible work lounge, or whatever the hell she had decided it was. I told her I was not escalating anything. I was ending the part where she still had access. She gave me the key, but not before making sure I knew how unreasonable she thought I was being. She told me I was overreacting, that she had not done anything crazy, and that most people would be glad to help family instead of acting territorial. That word, territorial, was especially rich coming from someone standing in my apartment after bringing strangers into it. I told her that help requires being asked, and what she had done had nothing to do with asking. It had to do with deciding first, and hoping I would not make it ugly later. She left after that, and when the door finally shut behind her, I stood there in the middle of the living room trying to work out what exactly I knew versus what I only suspected. I knew she had used the apartment multiple times without asking. I knew she had brought people over. I knew she had gotten comfortable enough inside my space to treat my bedroom like somewhere she could sit and work with someone else. What I did not yet know was whether I had already seen the worst of it or just the first layer. I went through the apartment carefully after she left, not in some dramatic detective way, but in the tired, methodical way you do when you have reached the point where your own instincts are no longer enough and you need actual confirmation. I checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen, and then finally my desk in the corner of the living room, where I keep a drawer with extra batteries, random receipts, and all the little household junk that builds up when you live somewhere long enough. That is where I found the first thing that turned my suspicion into something much more specific. There was a folded printout tucked under a notebook that did not belong there. At first I thought it was just one of her papers, maybe something she had forgotten in the scramble of leaving, but when I pulled it out and looked at it properly, I saw screenshots of what looked like a listing draft. There were photos of my apartment. Not all of it, but enough. The living room, the kitchen, part of the bedroom, cropped in a way that was clearly meant to look wider and cleaner than it really was. Under the images were lines of text, partial descriptions, pricing notes, and a heading that included the word guest. I just stood there staring at it for a second, because sometimes your brain still tries to protect you from the most embarrassing explanation by offering weaker ones first. Maybe she was helping a friend with a listing and used random example screenshots. Maybe it had nothing to do with my place. Maybe guest meant something else. But none of those thoughts survived contact with the photos. It was my couch, my kitchen, my stupid lamp near the chair. There was no version of reality where that paper was unrelated to my apartment. That was the moment Airbnb stopped being a passing thought and became the center of the whole thing. I sat down and looked through the pages more carefully. It was not a finished listing, not that I could tell, but it was close enough to show intention, and intention was more than enough. There were notes about quiet area, good for remote work, and self-check-in flexible depending on schedule. And that last phrase made my stomach drop harder than the photos themselves, because it explained everything I had been noticing. The dishes, the smell, the moved furniture, the weird sense that somebody had been in the apartment in ways that did not line up with her earlier explanations. She had not just been using the place because it was convenient. She had been positioning it. I checked my phone and laptop after that, not because I thought she had direct access to anything important, but because when someone gets comfortable enough to use your home behind your back, you stop assuming the limit exists where it should. I changed the Wi-Fi password immediately, mostly on instinct, and then I started searching. Airbnb, booking platforms, rental sites, anything that might show a version of my apartment. It took longer than I expected because I did not even know what exact language to use. And for a while I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, and that maybe the printout was just some half-baked idea she never acted on. Then I found it. The listing was not under her name, or at least not obviously, but the photos were mine, the layout was mine, the couch was mine, and even the stupid little scratch near the bookshelf edge that I always notice when I vacuum was visible in one of the images if you zoomed in. The title was generic in the most irritating possible way, something like Quiet Modern Apartment in Great Area, which would have been funny if it had not been my actual home. I remember feeling two things at once then, and neither canceled the other out. The first was anger, obviously, but not the loud cinematic kind. It was colder than that, more focused. The second was something much uglier, which was embarrassment. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because there is something deeply humiliating about seeing your own life turned into a monetizable asset by someone close enough to know exactly how to get inside it. It is one thing to be disrespected. It is another thing entirely to realize someone saw your privacy and immediately recognized a business model. At that point, the whole story I had been told collapsed. This was not just about needing a quiet place to work or bringing a friend over once or twice or taking advantage of a spare key in a sloppy family way. This was organized enough to involve photographs, draft language, and a live listing. It did not matter whether she had completed the full plan yet or only done it once or twice, or told herself she was just trying something. The line had already been crossed so completely that the exact number of times almost stopped matching. I called her back immediately. This time she did not answer. That was the first honest reaction she gave me all day. She didn't answer the first time I called. And that silence hit differently than before, because now I wasn't just standing in my apartment noticing something off and waiting for an explanation. I was holding proof in my hand, and the difference between suspicion and confirmation changes the way you experience even a few seconds of delay. It stops being uncertainty and becomes resistance. I called again, and again it went to voicemail, and I knew she was avoiding me on purpose because she had picked up earlier that day without hesitation. People who answer casually when they think everything is under control do not suddenly miss calls by accident when things stop being convenient. I didn't leave a message because I wasn't interested in starting a conversation through a recording she could ignore or reinterpret later. I needed a direct response, not something she could step around. I sat there for a minute longer, looking at the listing on my screen, and the longer I looked at it, the more details I noticed that made it worse. There were small adjustments to the photos that I hadn't registered at first, angles that made the space look slightly larger, lighting that made everything look cleaner than it usually did at that hour, and descriptions that were just vague enough to avoid saying anything specific that could be traced back easily if someone complained. It wasn't amateur in the way I had hoped it would be. It was careful. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of what exactly did she do, and started thinking in terms of how far is this going to go if I don't shut it down right now. Because once someone reaches the point where they are comfortable putting your home online for strangers, even in a half-finished way, they are not thinking about it as a one-time slip. They are thinking about it as an option. I called her one more time, and this time she picked up. Her voice sounded different immediately. Not panicked, but tighter, like she already knew the version of the conversation we were about to have, and was trying to control it before it got out of her hands. She asked what was going on, which was almost impressive in how quickly she tried to flip the tone, as if I was the one calling with some vague concern instead of confronting her about something very specific. I didn't waste time asking questions that could be deflected. I told her I had found the listing, and there was a pause on the line that was longer and heavier than any of the earlier ones, the kind of pause that doesn't try to pretend anymore. It was the first completely honest moment she had given me, because it was the only one she didn't have time to shape. Then she started talking. She didn't deny it outright, which I give her credit for in a very narrow sense, but she immediately tried to shrink it. She said it wasn't what it looked like, that she had just been testing something, that she hadn't actually hosted anyone yet, and that she was going to talk to me about it before doing anything serious. The problem with that kind of explanation is that it relies on a version of time that doesn't exist. You don't take photos, write descriptions, and publish a listing draft for a place you don't own as a casual thought experiment. You do it because you are already moving in that direction. I asked her directly if anyone had stayed in my apartment through that listing. She hesitated again, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed, even before she said anything. Then she said something that managed to be both technically defensive and completely revealing at the same time. She said not in the way I was thinking, which meant exactly what it sounded like it meant. Not in the obvious, full version, but something close enough that she didn't want to say it cleanly. I told her to stop playing with wording and give me a straight answer. That's when she admitted that someone had stayed there once, just one night, and that it wasn't even a big deal because they were quiet, they didn't touch anything, and she made sure everything was clean afterward. She said it like she was trying to reassure me that the damage had been minimal, as if the only thing that mattered was whether the person left marks on the furniture. I remember feeling something shift in my chest when she said that, and it wasn't just anger. It was that specific kind of disbelief that comes from hearing something so out of line that your brain has to recheck the sentence for a second to make sure you heard it correctly. Someone had slept in my bed, in my apartment, arranged by my sister, without my knowledge, and she was presenting it as a small experiment that had gone fine. I told her, very clearly, that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore and that I needed her to explain exactly what she thought she was doing. She started talking faster then, not louder, but faster, like she was trying to build a version of the story that sounded reasonable enough to survive the conversation. She said she had been thinking about ways to make extra money, that she had seen people doing short-term rentals and making decent income, and that since my place was in a good area and I wasn't always home, it felt like a wasted opportunity. That phrase, wasted opportunity, landed harder than everything else combined because it translated my entire living space into something she evaluated based on efficiency rather than ownership. In her mind, my apartment was not primarily my home. It was an underutilized asset that she had the ability to activate. I asked her if she had any idea how insane that sounded, and she pushed back for the first time in a way that wasn't just defensive. She said I was being dramatic and that she wasn't trying to take over anything. She was just trying to make use of something that sat empty for large parts of the day. She said it like she was explaining a simple optimization problem, not a complete violation of basic boundaries. I told her it didn't matter if the place was empty for 20 hours a day or not, because it was still mine, and the decision about who enters it doesn't change depending on whether I'm physically inside it at a given moment. She kept trying to pull it back to practicality. She said she needed money, that things were tight, that she thought I would understand once she explained it, and that she planned to loop me in after she saw if it worked. That last part made it worse, not better, because it confirmed exactly what I had suspected from the start. She had already decided, already acted, and only intended to involve me once there was something to show, as if the existence of results would make the method acceptable. I told her to take the listing down immediately. She didn't argue that point for long, which told me she knew there was no way to defend it directly. She said she would remove it, but then she tried to add that we could still talk about doing something like this properly in the future if we agreed on it, which was almost impressive in how completely it missed what I was saying. It wasn't about setting it up properly. It was about the fact that she had already crossed a line that didn't depend on how organized the plan was. I told her there was no version of this where strangers were coming into my apartment for money, whether I was home or not, and that this wasn't a business discussion. This was me telling her that what she had already done was completely unacceptable and that it was over. She got quiet then, not because she agreed, but because she realized the conversation was no longer something she could steer. There is a point in arguments like this where one side stops negotiating and starts setting terms. And when that happens, the tone shifts whether people like it or not. I told her I was changing the locks that day and that she would not have access to my apartment anymore. She reacted to that immediately, saying I didn't need to go that far, that I was turning a mistake into something bigger than it needed to be, and that we could just reset things without making it permanent. The word reset almost made me laugh, because there is no reset button for something like this. You don't go back to neutral after finding out your own home has been listed online and used without your knowledge. You move forward differently. I told her this wasn't punishment, it was consequence, and that if she had treated my space like something she could control, then she no longer got the benefit of access. She tried one more time to pull it back into family language, saying we should handle things like this between us instead of making big changes, and I told her this was exactly me handling it, just not in the way she wanted. After that, the conversation ended without anything that could be called resolution. She said she would take the listing down, and I said I would be changing the locks, and neither of us pretended the other one was happy about it. I hung up and sat there for a minute, not because I was unsure about what I had just said, but because I was letting it settle into something final. Up until that point, even with all the signs and all the arguments, there had still been a small part of the situation that felt reversible. Once you say you are cutting off access and mean it, that part disappears. I got up, grabbed my keys, and went out to find a locksmith. The whole walk there felt strangely calm compared to what had been building up in my head over the last hour. There is something about making a concrete decision that cuts through all the noise. Before that, everything had been layered, messy, and open to interpretation. After that, it was simple. She would not have a key anymore. No one would be entering my apartment without me knowing. Whatever arguments happened after that would happen on stable ground, not in a space that could be quietly repurposed behind my back. While I was waiting for the locksmith, I checked the listing again, and I watched as it disappeared from the platform. Whether she removed it immediately after our call or had already started doing it while we were talking, I couldn't tell, but seeing it gone didn't make me feel better in the way I expected. It just confirmed that it had been real. When the locksmith finished, I stood in the doorway for a second longer than usual before locking it for the first time with the new key. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it carried weight in a way small physical actions sometimes do when they represent something larger. It wasn't just a lock. It was a line that had finally been made visible. And for the first time since this whole thing started, the apartment felt like it belonged to me again in a way that didn't require explanation. When I got back inside after changing the locks, the apartment felt quiet again, but not in the same way it used to. Before all of this, the quiet in my place was something I didn't even notice most of the time, because it was just the default state. Now it felt like something I had to actively restore, like I had just taken the first step in getting things back to normal, but the normal itself still needed time to settle. I went through everything slowly that evening, not because I thought I would find something else, but because I needed to remove the feeling that anything in the apartment still belonged to someone else's decisions. I changed the bedding, wiped down the surfaces, reorganized a few small things that didn't even need to be moved, and by the time I was done, it looked almost exactly like it had before any of this started. The difference was that now I was paying attention to every detail in a way I hadn't before, because I knew how easily that sense of control could be taken for granted. My phone stayed quiet for a while after the call with my sister, and I knew that silence wouldn't last. Situations like this don't end with one person deciding something and everyone else just accepting it. They stretch out into conversations, explanations, and attempts to soften what already happened. Sure enough, later that evening, my mom called. Her tone was different from the start, not because she agreed with what I had done, but because she had clearly already spoken to my sister and understood enough of the situation to know this wasn't something she could brush aside with the usual, "you're overreacting" approach. She asked what was going on in a careful way, like she was testing how much room there was to move before things turned into a bigger conflict. I told her exactly what happened, without trying to make it sound worse than it already was. I explained that my sister had used my apartment multiple times without telling me, that she had brought people over, and that she had actually put the place on Airbnb and had someone stay there. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't add anything dramatic, because the facts were already enough. There was a pause on the line after that, and it was one of those pauses where you can almost hear the person on the other end adjusting their understanding in real time. She didn't deny it, which I expected, because by then there wasn't anything left to deny. Instead, she shifted to the next most familiar position, which was trying to frame the situation in a way that reduced how serious it sounded. She said my sister was under a lot of pressure, that she had been trying to figure things out financially, and that sometimes people make bad decisions when they feel cornered. All of that might have been true, but it had nothing to do with what I was actually saying. The problem wasn't that my sister needed money or that she was stressed. The problem was that she had used my home like it was something she could manage and profit from without my permission. I told my mom that I understood things were difficult for her, but that didn't change what she had done. I also told her that I had already changed the locks and that my sister no longer had access to the apartment. That was the part that shifted the tone of the conversation more than anything else, because it made it clear this wasn't just an argument about what should have happened. It was a decision about what was going to happen moving forward. She said that might have been a bit extreme, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, not because she was unsure, but because she knew she didn't have a strong argument against it. Calling something extreme is often just a way of expressing discomfort when you can't actually justify the opposite position. I told her that it only felt extreme because the situation itself had been pushed too far, and that if things had stayed at the level of asking first, none of this would have been necessary. She didn't agree directly, but she didn't argue either. Instead, she asked if there was any way to calm things down between me and my sister, which is something she always does when conflict reaches a point she can't smooth over with explanations. She tries to move everyone toward a version of the outcome where nobody feels like they lost too much, even when one side clearly crossed a line. I told her that calming things down didn't mean pretending it didn't happen, and that for me, the most important thing right now was that it didn't happen again. That was the part one kept coming back to, because everything else was already done. I couldn't undo the listing, I couldn't undo the fact that someone had stayed in my apartment, and I couldn't undo the fact that my sister had seen my space as something she could use that way. What I could do was make sure the same situation didn't repeat itself under the same assumptions. The conversation with my mom ended without any kind of resolution, but it didn't need one. The important part was that she understood what had happened in full, not in the softened version she had probably heard first. Whether she agreed with me completely or not didn't matter as much as the fact that she knew exactly where the line was now. My sister didn't call that night. That silence said a lot more than any argument would have, because it showed she wasn't ready to deal with the situation directly. People tend to avoid conversations where they know they don't have a strong position, especially when the other person has already taken a concrete step like changing the locks. There wasn't much she could say that would shift things back in her favor without admitting what she had done. The next day, she finally sent a message instead of calling. It was long enough to look like an explanation, but structured in a way that tried to keep the focus away from the main issue. She wrote about how stressed she had been, how she didn't think it would become such a big deal, and how she had planned to tell me before anything serious happened. She also said she thought I would understand because it was just for a short time, and because she knew I wasn't always home. That last part stood out again, because it showed the same underlying assumption I had been noticing from the beginning. In her mind, my absence made the apartment available in a practical sense, even if it wasn't technically hers. That was the core of the problem, and it was still there in the way she explained things. I replied, but I kept it simple. I told her that the issue wasn't how long it was supposed to last or how much pressure she was under. The issue was that she made decisions about my space without asking me and only planned to include me after the fact. I also told her that this wasn't something that could be fixed with an explanation, and that from now on, anything involving my apartment needed to be discussed before it happened, not after. She didn't respond right away, and when she did later, the message was shorter. She said she understood why I was upset, even if she didn't agree with everything, and that she wouldn't do anything like that again. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was closer to acknowledging the actual problem than anything she had said before. After that, things didn't go back to how they were before, but they didn't completely fall apart either. We still saw each other at family gatherings, and we still had normal conversations, but there was a difference in how we interacted. It wasn't something obvious you could point to in one moment. It was more like a shift in how things were handled overall. She didn't assume access to my space anymore, and she didn't treat it like something that could be used in the background of whatever she was dealing with. My parents adjusted too, even if they never said it out loud. They stopped treating my apartment like an extension of family solutions and started asking about things they used to assume. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was noticeable if you paid attention. The biggest change, though, was on my side. Before all of this, I didn't think much about the boundaries I had set because I assumed they were obvious. I assumed that giving someone a spare key didn't require a long explanation about what it didn't allow them to do. I assumed that family understood the difference between having access and having permission. After everything that happened, I stopped making those assumptions. I was more direct about what I expected, and I paid more attention to how people responded to that. Not because I wanted to control everything, but because I had seen how easily things can shift when expectations are left vague. The apartment eventually felt normal again, but not in the same way as before. Before, it felt normal because nothing had happened. After, it felt normal because I had taken back control of it. That difference might not seem like much from the outside, but once you've had to draw a line like that in your own space, you don't really go back to the version of normal where you assume people will respect it automatically. You understand that they might, but you also understand that they might not. And that changes how you protect what's yours.